Then we have the story of Alice Hinman in Adventure, and the thing that Anderson was kind of famous for was developing the sort of, I would guess we might call it a bit of a minimalist style, and had later influence on writers we're going to read such as Hemingway and Fitzgerald a little bit. But the stripped down style where you just sort of tell simply the story and these character driven dramas. So you have this character on the stage, Alice, and she's the 27-year-old member of this community who is just, again, a lonely, sort of unconnected person in town. Loneliness is really the key feature of this story. But what is interesting is, again, there's, from a modern perspective, a pretty frank discussion of what has fixated her. So, in this modern idea that Anderson seems to be playing around with, if he is overtly thinking of Freud at all, or just the sort of way that folks are thinking about people and characters and communities at this time in this modern condition, she definitely does suffer this lack of connection with a broader social community. She feels not just repressed, but she feels perhaps a bit fixated, and she seems to be fixated in two ways. She's 27 years old in the story. She's fixated in this time when she was about 16, and she met this man, Ned Curie, who was a little bit older than her, and they had this sort of passionate affair, and it has this kind of clinical description in the story on page 262, for example. When she was a girl 16 and before she began to work in the store, Alice had an affair with a young man. The young man named Ned Curie was older than Alice. He, like George Willard, was employed by the Winesburg Eagle, and for a long time he went to see Alice almost every evening. Together the two walked under the trees through the streets of town and talked of what they would do with the rest of their lives. Alice was then a very pretty girl, and Ned Curie took her in his arms and kissed her. He became excited and said things he did not intend to say to Alice, betrayed by her desire to have something beautiful come into her rather narrow life, and she also grew excited. She also talked. The outer crust of her life, all of her natural diffidence and reserve was torn away, and she gave herself over to the emotions of love. But is it love? What is compelling Ned, obviously, is passion, desire. It doesn't seem like he's a terrible person that he's trying to, play her. But he gets wrapped up in this passionate thing, and it goes in part of this conversations that I think these modernists and what we saw in the naturals were trying to work out was in this world we want to be super realistic about the prospects of faith, love, and I think if you really take a close look at those passages on page 262 to 263 and their relationship, it's kind of again this clinical description that we're going through. But again, this there's not much romance there. There's these ideas of dreams or some greater thing, but Alice is clearly banking on this. I don't think Ned thinks that he's going to abandon Alice or whatnot, but there's something deep inside which is compelling them to do and say things that they on the surface think they're controlling, but they really have no control over in this sort of psychological way. They have this discussion about marriage, and Ned is just puzzled. He's puzzled by how much Alice is attracted to him, and he kind of wants to protect her, but he's also a little bit worried about this, obviously. She seems to be kind of obsessed with him. And then when he abandons her, and again, I don't think it's purposely, but he goes to Cleveland and then on to Chicago, and he's not doing real well. And then she falls out of his life, and he moves on and does other things, but she stays fixated. And so she's fixated on this 16-year-old sort of version of herself that sort of has this rupture later in the story when she has, as the title says, this adventure. And it's all fixated in this primal sort of moment, the primal scene, as Freud and Freudian scholars would say, when they are, and the term is used interestingly in the story, when they learn to stick together and learn to stick to each other through this bonding that they have through their physical intimacy. So they got out of the buggy this night when he's getting ready to leave, and in the dim light, they became lovers. When at midnight they returned to town, they were both glad. It did not seem to them that anything that could happen in the future could blot out the wonder and beauty of the thing that had happened. They've had sex. Now we will have to stick to each other. Whatever happens, we will have to do that, Ned Curry said as he left the girl at her father's door. And then we know what happens. Ned Curry falls out of her life. But she is fixated on this and obsessed with him and this memory, and not even the reality of their situation, but this memory. And I think it is interesting that it's fixated in this sort of sexual um, uh, connection that they had before he departed. And so that all these years later, 10 years later or so, she's still sort of obsessed, and she is finding no outlets for these desires that were awoken by Ned Curie. She has the opportunity to go to church. The answer doesn't seem to be there in the prayer group. Bush Milton seems to be a very not Bush Milton. Her mother remarries kind of for convenience sake, um, and she has the opportunity to sort of pick up on something to bring meaning in this sort of springtime in Winesburg. She starts going to church. Sadness swept over them. It's on page 264. She's thinking out loud. She says, sadness swept over her. Dropping to her knees, she tried to pray, but instead of prayers, words of protest came to her lips. It is not going to come to me. I will never find happiness. Why do I tell myself lies? She cried. And with an odd sense of relief came with this, her first bold attempt to face the fear that had become a part of her everyday life. Her loneliness. So instead she turns to prayer, but in that sort of way that Freud says, this is a mass delusion. Don't go down this path. Pain is easy. Happiness is hard. And I don't think these words are accidentally chosen. I think Anderson is trying to get us to think about this notion of staring the loneliness, the oppression right in the face and dealing with it. So she tries in a variety of ways to get past this. She starts seeing this man, so to speak, Will Hurley, but he's he's not Ned Curry, and Ned Curry's not Ned Curry. It's the fixation of the Ned Curry that she had of her 16-year-old youth that she can't get past. And so, she were to go to therapy, maybe a therapist would say, look, you got to put that behind you. That's the thing that we need to fix you from being so stuck on. It's interesting use of term, we're going to have to stick on each other. Well, she's stuck on Ned Curie, and she won't be happy until she can maybe get past that moment of her life. So she attempts to deal with this, and Will is just not doing it for her. And so we have this interesting scene where she strips down naked one night. She just can't find this human connection, right? Kneeling beside the bed, she caressed it, whispering words over and over like of her refrain. Why doesn't something happen? Why am I left here alone? She muttered. Although she sometimes thought of Ned Curie, she no longer depended on him. Her desire had grown vague. She did not want Ned Curie or any other man. She wanted to be loved, to have something answer the call that was growing louder and louder within her. And I'm wondering if it is love at all, but just desire, a sexual need. But she is repressed. And this repression breaks when she has this quote-unquote adventure. This strange desire takes possession of her. She has no control over it in some ways. Without stopping to think, without the ego intervening, period emerges. Without stopping to think and what she intended to do, she ran downstairs through the dark house and out into the rain. And she's naked. And it could be this sort of erotic sexual thing. She's naked in the rain, but instead she goes out into this deserted town. All she's doing is seeking some connection, right? It's not sexual at all. It's pathetic, cold, sad, and she is infantilized, if anything. She's like a babe wandering around in the cold night, And the one connection she tries to make is she reaches out to this old man, and she says, she calls out to him. Uh, she wanted to leap and run, to cry out, to find some other lonely human and embrace him. This is on page 265 and then 266. On the brick sidewalks before the house, a man stumbled homeward. Alice started to run. A wild, desperate mood took possession of her. What do I care who he is? Who it is? He is alone, and I will go to him, she thought. And so this one moment of connection, look what Anderson does for us here. Wait, she cried, don't go away. Whoever you are, you must wait. The old man on the sidewalk stopped and stood listening. He was an old man and somewhat deaf. Putting a hand to his mouth, he shouted, What? What? Say? So just imagine this scene. This old man, she's trying to connect with anybody, anything. She's naked in the rain, and it's just this feeble old man going, "Ah, what's going on?" There is an absurd sort of moment of the modern condition represented in this, and Alice loses it. She falls to the ground trembling. She goes up to her room. She's shivering. She's in her nightdress. And then she buries herself in her pillow and wept brokenheartedly. What is the matter with me? I will do something dreadful if I'm not careful, she thought, turning her face to the wall, began trying to force herself to face bravely the fact that many people must live and die alone, even in Winesburg. It's not a very happy ending, is it? But I think it's a sort of a description of what happens when one can't get past a moment of trauma or a primal scene, or they are so repressed that eventually, if there is no outlet, she has no outlet to channel her desires and her frustrations, and so it erupts in this sort of night when she completely exposes herself to the world, and the world kind of is cold and heartless and rejects her. There is no connection. Welcome to the modern.